Hi, my name is Khalil Cumberbatch, and I'm the Associate Vice President of Policy at the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. And welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal justice system from various perspectives, including those most impacted by the criminal justice system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at TheFortuneSOC. Today's show is titled Wonder Women, the impact women have on social justice movements. My guest today is Carmen Perez, the Executive Director of the Gathering for Justice, a non-for-profit founded by legendary artist and activist Harry Belafonte. Carmen has crossed the globe promoting peace through civil and human rights, building alternatives to incarceration and violence, and providing commentary and guidance for state and federal policy creation. Carmen also sits on the advisory board of Rise to Run, an organization providing support and resources for progressive women running for office. And she is a board member of the Institute for Asian Pacific American Leadership and Advancement. Thank you for joining us today, Carmen.
It's my honor and pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. I think your bio doesn't do you nearly as much honor as I know you are as an amazing person, amazing advocate. So tell our viewers, here's Carmen Perez, right? Woman who spans the globe, does amazing work in communities in this country and all over the world. Tell our viewers how you got here. Like, how did you get to this point in your life, in your career? Like, give our viewers just a little bit of your trajectory.
I think that's one of my favorite questions, particularly because when people see us, whether it's the Women's March or it's Justice League NYC or the Gathering for Justice, they see somebody who's visible. And I always want to remind people that I started when I was a teenager. I started when I was 17 years old after I had lost my sister. She was killed in a vehicular car accident. And she was buried on my 17th birthday. Her and I were a day apart in 2 years. She was 2 years older than me. But my passion for criminal justice and fighting against police brutality and working on advocating for the rights of women had come way before she passed away. My brother was in and out the system, so I grew up with the duality of having somebody in the system and then having somebody taken, life taken, and navigating the system through victims. And it was really my father who taught me what restorative justice was. He had, told the DA he didn't want to press charges and take another mother's child away. And I thought that was so profound. At 17, I didn't get it, right? I'm a 17-year-old. I lost my sister, the person who I wanted to be just like. But then as years went on and I really developed my passion, those words always resonated with me. And I grew up playing basketball in a farm community outside of LA called Oxnard. Grew up in a very diverse community with a lot of folks that were from the API community, Samoan, huge African-American community and Chicano community. So the work that I do around women's issues and intersectionality and showing up for Black lives as an ally has really been a reflection of my childhood and really has led me to be intentional about my organizing. But I started as a youth advocate. I was a teenager working with young people that were impacted by the system, creating job opportunities for them, and ultimately supporting them in developing their own voices to change some of the local policies in Santa Cruz County. From there, I went on to work in prisons and to organize cultural and spiritual ceremonies for lifers through the Mexican American Culture Committee and the African American Culture Committee at Tracy DVI. And I really found this connection to the people that were incarcerated. As my mentor always says, his name's Nane Alejandres, those are our relatives that are in there. And they truly are, whether they're our blood relatives or not. The people, I learned so much and I was so young, but my passion has always been working with people that are the most impacted and marginalized, because that's really kind of who I was growing up. I grew up in a community that was plagued by violence and gangs, family members that were gang members. My father today in 2018 is 94 years old. Wow. So, when I say my childhood is a reflection of my current life, Harry Belafonte, who's my boss and my mentor, is somebody who is 91. And so I have the elder and the elder wisdom, certainly the energy of the youth and understanding that we have to cultivate the next generation. I have 16 nieces and nephews that I love. I think the oldest 2 are 28, the youngest is 4 years old, and really he's the ringleader. His name's Kingston, and I love him. But I have older siblings, and so again, always being in a place where I was the youngest. I studied psychology for self-healing. I always knew I wanted to help people. I just didn't know how. I also studied Chicana feminism, where I learned about the contributions that women made to our society, to social justice movements, to media, that were never really visible. And so learning from a professor like Aida Hurtado, and really being taught what intersectionality was, is again the way in which I'm intentional about my organizing. But I didn't show up, and I wasn't Carmen Perez, and there was a lot of times where I failed. There was many times where I didn't know what I was doing, but I led with my heart, and I truly felt that people really believed in me, and there were times where I didn't speak for a long time. Now you see me very vocal with my fist up in the air, and you see me on the front lines and going against elected officials and fighting for policies and, speaking at rallies. But a lot of who I was in my 20s and my 30s was just an observer, somebody who was learning from those that were directly impacted, also learning from our elders like the Nanes and the Harry Belafontes and the Aida Hurtados, and sometimes being the fly on the wall and taking those lessons and really applying it to our generation and figuring out how is it that I could build collective power with people who I respect and I love. And that's really how I founded Justice League. Is I knew I wasn't going to get any foundation to really give us money to do this type of work. I had seen organizations that I had worked for not being able to get funded, because when you change lives, that's not something that you could write in a grant proposal, right? How can you really measure success? And there's times in which the work that you're doing with individuals sometimes isn't, a success story in the way in which they view it, but we see it as a success when you could get a young person not to use meth for a month, right? Or when a young person is able to get a job, or you're able to see men from different ethnic groups in a prison holding hands during the friendship dance. To me, that's success, but you can never really write that on a proposal. So I felt that it was important for me to identify people with different skill sets who I felt were impactful in their own way, and for us to build collective power. And so I feel, again, the work that I do is really a reflection of, being able to be coached by somebody like a Pat Bell, who was my basketball coach from the age of 6 all the way to college, who really taught me life lessons. And I really see myself in this role in whatever I do as a coach, as a bridge keeper, as somebody who could bridge the gap between the youth and the elders, those that have access, those that don't, those that are incarcerated, those that, are working towards liberation. And so, it takes time, it takes failing, and it takes a lot of heart.
Yeah. So in keeping in tune with the title of the show, Wonder Women, I would love for you to talk a little bit to our viewers about your role in the Women's March and your view on what the role of women of color is in social justice movements, what it has historically been, and what the role of white women is in that movement as well?
So my role within the Women's March was, and so I hope everybody knows that the Women's March was really ignited because a woman, after the election of Donald Trump, had posted and sent a message to 40 of her friends that she wanted to march on Washington. The next morning, she woke up to tens of thousands of people wanting to march with her. And I think within 24 to 48 hours, there was a lot of pushback because it was originally called the Million Women March, and erasing the work that Black women had done 20 years prior, right, during the Million Women March that had happened in Philadelphia. And so that's why it's important to have women of color in the space, right? Within the 50-something hour, Tamika Mallory and myself were called on three-way with two other white women that were talking about centering women of color in the space. And by then they had already changed the name to the March on Washington, Women's March on Washington. And, you know, I didn't have the right to say I wasn't going to do it. I don't need another title. I'm the co-founder of Justice League NYC, expanding to California. We had just come off the cuff of building Growing Up Lockdown, our 3-day juvenile justice conference in Oxnard, my childhood hometown. Had just done concerts in a juvenile detention center and in the community. So I thought I was coming home to rest. I thought I was coming back to New York to strategize with my family. But in reality, I was coming back to pick up a different type of responsibility. And so when I was asked, I thought about, well, who else? Who else is going to be intentional about their organizing? Who else is going to be grounded in an ideology that allows us to attack the forces of evil, not people doing evil? Because you get rid of Donald Trump, you understand that Donald Trump is just one of the symptoms to the reality that there is racism that exists in our country. So we said yes, particularly because I felt it was my responsibility to make sure that my community was involved in this march, knowing that in every type of action that we do, it's mainly white people that show up. They have the access to show up, right? And so we ended up hubbing the Women's March under the Gathering for Justice, using the ideology of Kingian nonviolence, which we've been organizing around the country with. We also were responsible for the administrative piece of the Women's March, but more so the partnerships, getting people to want to participate, to want to partner with us. And because of the work that we had been doing for 20 years and organizing and building across the country, we were able to get some of our friends to contact their constituencies to also support the Women's March. So we brought on, myself and my team brought on about 570 partners within 10 weeks of planning the Women's March. I co-conspired with Linda Sarsour, my sister in the movement, to put together policy points. And we thought, well, we can't just talk about reproductive justice. One, because we as women of color, women are not monolithic, right? We are impacted by various issues. I know myself, I have a family member that's formerly incarcerated. I have a mother who migrated here from Mexico. I have undocumented family members. We grew up in poverty. We grew up with violence. In our face and in our environment. So again, we needed to make sure that we created entry points for people to get involved and not make it about one issue, but really make it about different issues. And so if people wanted to show up for reproductive justice, that's what they did, right? If people were supporting women who were incarcerated, needed access to health care and not be shackled while giving birth, and we invited that those women to participate. So we brought together about 27 women, gender nonconforming and trans women, to create our Points of Unity document, which is our policy platform that was called the most radical policy platform in the history of any march. And so we also were responsible for, Tamika, myself, Lyndon, and several other women for the program, making sure that some of our folks that we work with were also part of this display of unity and solidarity. And so there were many roles that we played as women of color: the strategy, the programming, the partnerships, the influencer roundtable working for Harry Belafonte. We made him one of the national co-chairs one of the honorary national co-chairs of the Women's March, particularly because he had been part of the original March on Washington and had given us so much information about how it was important to make sure that we had a message. It was important to include labor in the conversation. It was important to include people from different walks of life, and what were we going to leave behind to the people. So there are moments when he would sit with us and he would give us this historical analysis about his time with Dr. King and all the organizers from the original march. And then we brought in Gloria Steinem, who also took the time to sit with us and really share with us what it was like during her time as a feminist and really on the front lines. And people, we had conversations with Diane Nash, who was part of the civil rights movement. Dolores Huerta was another honorary co-chair. So we did a lot as the women of color. And I will say that I feel that all the organizing that I did, from the first time that I met a young girl when she was coming out of the detention center, from the time I went into the prisons of El Salvador, or I organized and slept on benches and floors in Columbus, Ohio, or Little Rock, Arkansas, really prepared me to be in the leadership of the Women's March. But I will be honest, it really took our soul because there was criticism that this was a white women's march. A lot of women of color did not want to participate because they felt that, maybe some of what was being shared online did not represent them. And so we did our best to make sure that as we were having real conversations in the organizing space around racism and white privilege and white supremacy, and intersectionality, that we were mirroring those conversations online through Facebook and Instagram. And it was difficult. We constantly talked about courageous conversations and daring discussions, and there were moments when we would have these major blow-ups. But all along, what really kept us going was the fact that we kept our eyes on the prize, and that was January 21st. That was to ensure that people felt as though they were welcome into this space. We said, if you believe that women's rights are human rights, then you are welcome to be part of the Women's March.
And so January 21st was the day after
the inauguration.
President Trump's inauguration.
Yes.
And so this was the moment where the march was going to happen, and there was much more anticipation for that march than there was for the actual inauguration.
Of course. I think a lot of people saw the Women's March as hope. I mean, I know for myself, when I was riding back from Washington, D.C. after being on the Roland Martin show, and we were hearing that Donald Trump was winning, I thought about my mother because, they talked about deporting people back to their homeland. And my mom, although she's now a citizen, I just kind of thought, well, how am I going to live without her? And I called her, and I was so angry because I also felt like, we were silent. Sometimes there's this anti-Mexican sentiment that happens in this country, and we were silent through we thought he was a joke. We didn't really think he was going to win, and I know many people thought he was going to win. But for me, I remember this despair, and I think everybody in the country felt that, right? They felt this despair, they felt a lack of hope. It was very gloomy, but the Women's March became that hope for them. And so we're proud of the fact that, yes, there were 4 national co-chairs, but there were 70 national organizers. There were 400 state coordinators. There were 70 or 90 global coordinators that brought out 5.2 million people. On January 21st of 2017, these people organized for 10 weeks straight. And again, that is a power of women. That is a power of women dedicating everything that they have in order to create a atmosphere that allows us to dream again and to think bigger. And I think that's why it's so important, one, to follow women of color.
And when you say follow women of color, clarify that for our viewers. Like, what does that really mean? Because I think some people hear that and they say, well, I follow Carmen on Twitter all the time, right? And like, I retweet her stuff and I like her stuff on Instagram all of the time.
And I appreciate that support. But I think it's really trusting our instincts, trusting our leadership. There are times when white women who don't have the experience that maybe myself, Tamika, and Linda have. We all have 20 years of organizing experience, and some of them, you know, Tamika was a civil rights baby. Her parents were involved in the civil rights, you know, but we still get questioned, right? People see this visibility that we have, yet don't recognize the fact that we've been doing this work without visibility, without resources, and this visibility doesn't always bring positive attention. It also brings death threats, and it, you know, there's a sacrifice to it. I know I've been away from my family for 21 years. After my sister passed away, I went away, and I never get to go to the birthday parties. And because of this movement, I sometimes miss Thanksgiving, or I always miss Thanksgiving, with the exception of maybe 4 years ago. I miss Christmas, because there's an urgency. And so I want to thank the contribution that women have made to social justice that has never really been recognized. There was Diane Nash, Audre Lorde. You know, there's so many women that we read about now, but during the time they were invisible, but they did the work. Betita Martinez, who was part of SNCC, Dolores Huerta, who was in the shadows of Cesar Chavez. And yes, we hear about her now, but during that time, you know, she had gotten a lot of criticism for her being on the front lines as a mother of many children. So again, I think one of the things that happens to us, particularly women of color, is that we get criticized often, and there's this expectation to be this wonder human, superpowered person, right? But we also appreciate the love and support that people give us, and you know, we hope that we continue to cultivate the leadership of women, and that's something that I've dedicated my life to. From working with girls in Santa Cruz, I created a program called the Girls Task Force to provide gender responsive programming for girls. Working with girls in the system has been something that I've always really was really connected to my heart, making sure that we weren't re-traumatizing while they were in the system. But, you know, I think what I ask of white women is, yes, you could be an ally, but being an ally sometimes isn't enough. You know, the safety pin is not enough. I think, and this is controversial anywhere. We talk about co-conspirators and we talk about accomplices. And I think accomplices has always, that's in a kind of like a criminal justice negative role. But Tamika and Linda are really my co-conspirators. They're my accomplices. You know, at this moment, we need people to show up on the front lines to, you know, to when we are getting attacked or protested against, to speak up on our behalf, to you know, take the blow for us, because this work isn't easy. And it's not just enough to confront white womanhood, to identify what your own privilege is. I think it's really important that white women begin to organize back in poor white communities and begin to do the real deep healing work that we have done as women of color. There's a way in which we are expected to show up. We're supposed to show up in a way that you know, is not too emotional, is not too loud, right? So I have to go do the deep work from my childhood trauma in order for me to show up in a place and to be strategic and to think about how I'm not re-traumatizing people, and I'm not showing up in a way that is taking away from anybody else. I'm also expected, as somebody who does racial justice work, to work in solidarity with other communities and learn about their communities and be in community with them. You know, white folks show up in our workplace often, and I don't ever hear that they're doing the work in their community too. You know, I do the work in my community because I feel it's my responsibility as somebody who has been able to make it out the hood, who went away to college. You know, I wasn't locked up myself outside of protest, and I'm not buried 6 feet under. So there's this responsibility that I feel as I'm looking forward. I also have to reach back and make sure that more members of my community are able to make it. And so I hope that white people begin to organize and to heal themselves from some of the trauma that they've experienced, and also that they perpetuate onto others. A lot of people show up in our space with white privilege not knowing that they're taking up too much space. I think we have these great talking points of like meet people where they're at, and some of us live by that because it's our ideology, but they hear us so often that then they pick up on it as well. And sometimes, you know, for me, that's more dangerous than having somebody who's just plain ignorant, right? And so I think that particularly white women as allies need to make room for women of color or who's missing from the table, and either, you know, scoot your chair over or give up your seat. As somebody who considers herself an ally, particularly to young people, I know I sometimes do not belong at the table. I also do that with, you know, there's recently a conversation that was being moderated by myself to talk about women in prison, and I felt it was important that somebody who was a woman who was formerly incarcerated needed to moderate that conversation. So sometimes it's important for us to also give up our seats.
So in the less than 2 minutes that we have, it felt like this went by like it was nothing. What would you say right now to a young Latina, Chicana, African-American sister in these days and times with our current administration and all of the bleakness that is staring in front of them? What would you tell one of our young folks to encourage them?
So I have a sister by the name of Sherelle Brown, who was part of Justice League, and I believe she lives either in South North Carolina or in DC, but she's a powerful sister. And I remember her looking at me and her saying, "You are powerful, you are loved, and you are necessary." And that's what I would tell our young people, our young women, is that, you know, look at me as an example of somebody who is dedicating my life to make sure that you could see yourself in the image of somebody who could be in leadership. And regardless of what you've been through life, you know, no one could take away your story, but it's important that we also make room for you to be successful, for you to thrive, and that's what we're going to dedicate our lives to do. Well, and so there's many of us that are working hard for that.
Thank you. What would you tell, how can our viewers learn more about your work? Where can they go to support the Gathering for Justice and other work that you're doing?
So you could go to our website, gatheringforjustice.org, womensmarch.com. I am at Miss MS Lady Justice 1 on Twitter and Instagram, and so follow our work.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Carmen, for being my guest. And thank you to the viewers tuning in. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in The Fortune Society. This is Khalil Cumberbatch, and I appreciate you joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.